things off with a moment of, well, profound and pretty painful discrimination experienced in maybe the most mundane place you can imagine. And we end up with this soaring, theological argument about structure of the universe and the guarantee of an eternal. So our mission here is to take this deeply personal account and really trace the author's logic. They argue that the specific instant prejudice they face proves that fundamentally earthly systems are just inadequate, and they propose prophecy as the necessary and a proven blueprint for securing a future where division is completely obliterated. It's quite a radical solution to an everyday kind of trauma, so we really need to see how they connect those dots.
Yeah, what jumps out immediately is just the sheer ambition of the source material here. It moves from what you might call microaggression, this one incident, to a huge macro-level solution in just, a few paragraphs. So the central question for us, I think, is how does a devastating personal experience, that shock of feeling instantly judged, lead directly to talking about universal eternal preparation? The author actually calls this blueprint the ultimate life hack. So if that's the claim, we have to analyze, the credibility of this map and the structure of the preparation it supposedly requires, especially given the stakes they claim.
Okay, right. Let's unpack this unusual starting point then. The scene itself is pretty relatable. A self-service printing kiosk. I mean, we've all been there, haven't we? Fumbling with screens, pressing the wrong thing, getting frustrated by the text. So the author is struggling to print their files. Then a young family walks up a woman, her husband, and a baby in a stroller. And apparently they handle the machine easily, instantly, and they're just waiting for a large print job to finish. So the author, in that moment of frustration, just asks the woman for help. A simple human request, right? In a public place.
And this is exactly where the interaction turns painful and intensely reflective for the author. The woman doesn't actually answer directly. Instead, she turns and whispers something quickly to her husband. The analysis provided in the source material is, frankly, startling because of the speed and the silence of what happens next. The husband immediately steps over to offer the author assistance, while at the exact same time, the wife moves, physically positions herself to shield the baby in the stroller from the author.
Wow. And the author's immediate read on the motive is, well, it's truly shocking. They perceive this move as a protective action, designed specifically to keep the child from seeing, quote, a very black man, with the potential reasoning being perhaps to prevent the baby from being scared or maybe even having nightmares later.
And the injury, as it's detailed in the source, was instantaneous. It wasn't just being refused help, not directly anyway. It was the implicit, powerful statement that the author's mere visual presence required the immediate protection of an infant. That level of silent, unchallenged, sort of preconceived judgment, it hits deep. And this is the critical distinction the author draws. No earthly system, no law, no company policy could possibly go back and fix the instant, profound hurt that shot through them right there in that print shop. You see, the legal and political frameworks, they address actions, maybe outcomes, but they fail completely against that internal, silent, immediate human judgment.
That's a really radical claim, though, isn't it? Are we really saying that earthly justice is just inherently incapable of solving the kind of prejudice shown at that print kiosk? The source must be deeply invested in the idea that the problem isn't just systemic policies, but the internal human capacity for judgment itself.
That's precisely the bridge the source is making.
Yeah.
Yes. This personal pain, this realization that the human flaw is internal, maybe intractable on Earth, it highlights for the author the urgent need for a solution that transcends our current systems entirely. The solution has to be universal. It must address the heart of the matter. And the only solution, they argue, is a future state where these divisions, which are ultimately based on flawed human perception, are completely, totally obliterated.
And that pivot, that's what leads us directly to the concept the source proposes as the solution: prophecy. They introduce this hopeful concept. It promises a time when God will physically dwell on earth and bring his perfect love to overcome judgment and division permanently. And they don't treat prophecy as just abstract scripture. They define it in really practical terms. It's the ultimate life hack. It's having the proven instructions for the universe's final and most important event, eternity. It sounds less like theology almost and more like a detailed technical roadmap.
Right. And to justify calling it a blueprint, you definitely need to prove its reliability. And the source leans heavily on historical fulfillment to do that. It points to events like the life of Jesus Christ, the dramatic events at Pentecost, and numerous other promises made thousands of years ago. The crucial validation point they make is that these prophecies often made little sense to the hearers at the time. They required immense faith, yet the source claims they were 100% fulfilled. So the argument is built on a track record. The blueprint works because its author has a perfect, verifiable fulfillment record.
Okay, so if the blueprint is proven, then the knowledge inside it must be incredibly valuable, like right now. You mentioned the source uses management terminology, hindsight, and managerial foresight. Can you help us translate that into practical terms for our lives today?
Yeah, this is where the application starts to become clear. The source explains that prophecies expose the preset, or you could say the hindsight, of God's final plan. Hindsight is knowing how past events, particularly those key events around redemption and justice, have already played out according to God's will. So once you have that hindsight, it generates what the source calls principles, or managerial foresight. If you know with 100% certainty how the universe ends with the permanent dwelling of perfect love, then you can use that guaranteed final outcome as the guiding metric for pretty much every decision you make right now. It's like risk management, where the future event is absolutely guaranteed. You basically get the answers to the final exam before you even enroll in the course, right? And you use those answers to structure your entire study plan.
Wow, that puts enormous weight on the future then. And speaking of that future, the source is really uncompromising about the ultimate destination. Eternity isn't presented as some abstract concept, it's stated as a flat certainty, not an if, it's a when. And here's where it gets interesting, because the source ties these theological certainties to, well, modern thinking. They mention sharp minds studying quantum physics who are starting to suggest that physical death might simply be a transition to another degree of reality, rather than just an absolute final blackout. And this aligns directly with the biblical view that existence doesn't simply shut off, you transition from one phase of reality to the next.
And that connection, it kind of elevates the theological claim by offering a parallel in physical sciences, this idea that existence is continuous, even if our state changes. So this raises a monumental question, doesn't it? If that appointment with eternity, that transition is definite, then ignoring the only available roadmap for the destination is labeled illogical by the author. It immediately becomes the highest stakes decision you will ever make. And the stakes are clarified even further by a specific external voice cited in the source. Pastor Femi Papula from RCCG UK, who asserts that when a person dies without Jesus Christ, they don't cease to exist. They transition into eternity, but, quote, without the mercy that only Jesus Christ offers and can give. So that preparation, guided by this blueprint, fundamentally determines the nature of the existence that follows. It's not just about where you end up, but specifically how you show up when you arrive at that transition point.
Okay, so if we circle back then to the central argument, that profound pain felt in the print shop, the choice to embrace faith is presented essentially as the smartest choice. It's framed as the investment that secures a future where perfect relationships and love structurally obliterate the possibility of events like that print shop incident ever happening again. It aims to fix that systemic internal human flaw that, as the source argues, earthly laws just haven't been able to touch.
Right. And the application of this blueprint is entirely about present action driven by that managerial foresight we talked about. If the outcome is guaranteed perfect love, then the only logical investment, according to this source, is to start adopting the principles of perfect love right now. The focus shifts entirely from just surviving the present environment, you see, to actively preparing for that inevitable future state. The smart choice is the investment that maximizes your return on what they present as a guaranteed event.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, beyond these grand theological claims? The author, after laying out this whole argument for the guaranteed future, poses a final, pretty direct challenge. If you truly have this proven blueprint for the most important event in the universe, an event whose certainty is supposedly verifiable through history and maybe even suggested by modern quantum thought, well, are you making the smart investment? We've definitely covered a vast territory today. We started with that devastating moment of prejudice in a very public place, and we traced the author's response all the way to the promise of universal, perfect love secured through what they call a proven divine blueprint. The source material really forces you to contend with the perceived inadequacy of the present and the asserted certainty of the future.
Yeah, the ultimate takeaway here seems to be this concept of applied certainty. The blueprint, as presented, is available. And if the future transition is guaranteed, then the time to start building and preparing based on those principles of managerial foresight, well, it's right now. It attempts to turn future hope into present actionable behavior.
And here's maybe a thought for you to carry forward from our deep dive today. If the knowledge of eternity, as presented here, means you must show up, either with God or, quote, away from his presence by choice, what unexplored area of your current, maybe a goal, maybe a relation, what area needs that exact kind of managerial foresight to help secure your someday? Could using the certainty of your desired future outcome guide your actions more effectively right now?
Please enjoy the podcast.
We're looking across millennia, all the way from Eden to, well, to the edge of eternity itself.
Yeah, that's right. And we've got this incredible stack of source material, ancient prophecies, history, even modern theological insights helping us piece it together.
Yeah, we're trying to synthesize everything from Daniel, Zechariah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, all the way through Peter, Paul, and Revelation. It's a huge scope.
It is. And the advantage we have now in the 21st century is looking back with historical context, archaeology, things scholars today use to interpret this. It gives us a perspective they didn't have back then.
Exactly. So our goal today, our mission, is pretty specific. We want to map out the process. How does that path of reconciliation, the one hinted at way back in Genesis 3 after the fall,
how does that actually lead to this eternal physical kingdom on earth that Daniel talks about? Daniel 2.44. And crucially, what does that transition look like?
Right.
What does it really mean for Christians to eventually, mingle with God directly, to actually behold his presence? That's the ultimate endgame here.
That's the core question. Seeing God, how does that become possible?
The sources, they really do provide a roadmap. It's about how that barrier, the purity barrier created by sin, gets systematically dealt with, cleansed.
Okay, so let's break this down. Let's start right at the beginning with the foundation, the actual blueprint for this permanent residence. So this blueprint, we're saying the plan for an eternal kingdom wasn't like an afterthought or just a metaphor. Not according to these sources, no.
Yeah.
Daniel 2.44 is pretty clear. God will establish a kingdom physically on earth and it won't be destroyed. It's intended for, well, pure men, as the source puts it, ready for his worship. And that intent goes way back, right after the fall, essentially.
Yes. And look, our perspective today, it's thousands of years later, 4,000 since Daniel, 2,000 since Peter and Paul. We've seen parts of Daniel's earlier prophecies, the empires, actually happen.
Right, the statue dream. Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome.
Exactly. That historical confirmation gives us a lot more confidence when we look at the final part of that prophecy, the kingdom of God. It lends weight to the idea that this too is literal, physical.
Okay, so if it's physical, we need physical evidence in the plan. You mentioned Genesis. Yeah, Genesis 3.15 gives the first hint, but the real anchor is the covenant with Abraham. Genesis 15, specifically verses 18 to 21. This is absolutely crucial for understanding the location of this permanent setup, the land covenant.
Precisely. It lays out the geographical, even the legal foundation for the kingdom's headquarters, and it's very specific about the boundaries, an earthly estate.
From the river of Egypt,
Uh-huh.
which is the Wadi el-Arish, right? Not the Nile.
Well, correct.
Yeah.
The Wadi of Egypt, all the way to the river Euphrates, that's a huge area.
Okay, wait, because if you look at a map today, or even historically, Israel has never controlled that entire territory, not even close. It stretches way into modern Iraq, Syria.
Yeah.
So are the sources really saying that exact landmass has to be literally occupied? Couldn't modern Israel be, I don't know, a symbolic fulfillment or a down payment? Well, the overwhelming view from the sources we're looking at is, no, it's literal and it's unfulfilled. And that very fact that the specified land hasn't been fully possessed to this day is presented as proof that the promise is still outstanding.
Exactly. It's proof that the physical establishment of the kingdom's headquarters is still future.
Yeah.
If it were just spiritual, why mention rivers and specific boundaries? The unfulfilled geography is like a placeholder, a signpost saying this part of the plan is still coming. That land will be the seat of government.
Okay, that makes sense. It really anchors the whole thing to this planet, to real geography.
It does. And that brings us to something absolutely vital for reading these prophecies correctly: context. We have to be so careful with the context.
Especially with certain key words, right? Yes. The sources warn us about three in particular: eternity, millennium, and temple. They could mean different things depending on whether the context is literal and physical or spiritual. Get that wrong, and the whole roadmap gets confused.
Yeah.
Okay, let's nail that down then. How do we tell? Take temple, for example. I read Ezekiel 40, and it sounds like blueprints for a massive building.
It does.
But then the New Testament talks about believers being the temple. So how do I know Ezekiel's isn't just, symbolic of a future worship system?
You look at the details in the text itself. Ezekiel doesn't just say temple. He gives, incredibly precise measurements. Gates, courts, chambers, altar dimensions, even instructions for priests, sacrifices, how they dress, where they prepare the meat.
Yeah, that doesn't sound very metaphorical.
Right. That level of architectural and procedural detail, it points overwhelmingly to a literal physical building existing during a specific time. That's the Millennial Temple.
Yeah. So physical dimensions, rituals that points to the millennial phase. But if the text talks about God's presence being the temple, like in Revelation,
Sure.
then you're likely looking at the spiritual reality of the eternal state. The context is the key. Same logic applies to millennium versus eternity. One's a defined 1,000-year transition on earth. The other is the final timeless state after judgment.
And we have to keep comparing sort of our human viewpoint with God's expectation.
Exactly. God's expectation is ultimate purity.
Yeah.
And that purity is the gatekeeper. Access to this kingdom isn't automatic.
Which brings us back to the challenge. How does one gain access? The sources are clear. It's not universal, right?
No, they emphasize the need for salvation through Jesus Christ. And they echo Joshua's challenge, choose this day whom you will serve. That choice determines entry. The whole cleansing process isn't just for the planet, it's for the people, preparing them to be in God's presence, to actually see him. Okay, so we have this Genesis blueprint, this physical land promise still waiting. But how did God make sure this plan wasn't just forgotten, especially when Israel itself, lost focus, went into captivity?
Well, this is where the story takes a really dramatic turn, because the next big reveal, comprehensive timeline, wasn't given in Jerusalem. It was given in Babylon.
And Nebuchadnezzar.
To Nebuchadnezzar, the pagan king who had just conquered Israel, the guy who was effectively the ruler of the known world at that time. And the sources emphasize he was genuinely curious, diligently asking about the future.
It says a lot about God's plan, doesn't it? That he reveals secrets about the final world order to the very symbol of the current secular world order. Daniel 7 touches on this too, God answering sincere inquiry.
It really does. And for the Jewish people, this was a massive shock to the system. They'd kind of lost that sense of being spiritually protected, maybe. Now they're enslaved by a pagan ruler, first time since Abraham, really. They're in Babylon, far from the promised land, that land defined back in Genesis 15.
They must have been questioning everything. Their relationship with God, their chosen status. Did the land promise even matter anymore?
Absolutely. Doubts were rampant. And it's right then, in slavery, that they get new instructions through Daniel, interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dream, that famous statue.
Head of gold, chest of silver, representing the empires.
Right. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome. It was a stark political picture of world history. But the crucial part for our discussion is how it ends.
The stone.
The stone. Cut without human hands. It hits the statue on its feet, the final mixed empire, and pulverizes the whole thing. Gone.
And Daniel says that stone is God's kingdom. Yes, the eternal kingdom established by God himself, which will break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. That's Daniel 2.44. It's divine intervention, smashing human systems and setting up his permanent rule. So Nebuchadnezzar got the big picture, the political succession. But Daniel, the sources say, he wanted more details. He had his own visions later, like in Daniel 7. Why, if the king already knew the outline?
Well, you could say the king's dream was the view from Earth, looking up. Geopolitical. Empires rising and falling. Daniel needed and God granted him the view from heaven, looking down.
The spiritual reality behind it all.
Exactly. His visions, like the four beasts, they reveal the nature of these powers, the spiritual forces at work, and give much more detail about the final kingdom and the events leading up to it. Daniel clarifies things earlier prophets only hinted at. He takes it from what will happen to how it happens and why.
And it's through Daniel, and then later the New Testament writers, that these two sort of major signposts on the road to eternity get clearly marked out.
That's right. They become critical for understanding the transition. Those two markers are the Millennium and the Temple. Okay, the Millennium. The sources are pretty specific here. It's a literal 1,000-year period. It's Jesus Christ physically reigning on earth. And it happens before the final eternal state, right? After his return, but before the final judgment.
Correct. It's an intermediate phase, transitional kingdom. And the emphasis is absolutely on physical. This isn't just a spiritual influence, it's described as a literal physical reign over the entire planet.
Governing the whole earth from Jerusalem, is that the idea?
That's the strong implication from the sources, yes.
Oh.
Jerusalem becomes the world capital, the headquarters established on that covenanted land. It's a radical shift in global power and administration.
And the sources even detail the administration under Christ during this time. You mentioned David earlier.
Yes, this is one of the most striking details. Jeremiah 30, verse 9, and other places suggest that King David himself will be resurrected and will rule specifically over Israel during the millennium.
Wow. So David himself, not a descendant or a type of David. The sources point to David himself resuming his throne. This reinforces that link back to the covenants, showing Israel as God's template nation, even within this global kingdom.
Okay, so you have Christ ruling the world, a resurrected David ruling Israel. What does that look like? A resurrected being governing mortals? Because people are still being born during this time, right?
Yes, that's part of the transitional nature. Mortals are still present, living under this divine administration. It implies a perfect government, direct delegation from Christ to David, ensuring God's standards are perfectly implemented in Israel, which then serves as a model for all nations, as Isaiah suggests.
And this perfectly governed kingdom needs a center of worship, which brings us to that millennial temple, the physical one.
The physical one, the brick and mortar structure from Ezekiel 40 to 45, situated in Jerusalem. It's distinct from the eternal state's temple. But here's the part that often causes confusion.
The sacrifices.
What?
The sacrifices. The sources are clear. Temple sacrifices are reinstituted during the millennium. Okay, that's the big question, isn't it? If Christ's sacrifice on the cross was the final ultimate atonement for sin, why bring back animal sacrifices? It feels like a step backward.
It does, until you understand their purpose in that specific context. The sources argue these millennial sacrifices are not for atonement. They don't forgive sin. Christ's death did that once for all.
So, what are they for?
They function primarily as a memorial and an instructional tool. Think of it like communion or the Passover Seder today they looked at.
Ah, okay. So they commemorate Christ's finished work.
Yes, and they serve to continually teach the mortal population, especially those born during the Millennium who never knew the premillennial world, about the holiness of God, the seriousness of sin, the cost of redemption, and the standard of righteousness required in his kingdom. It's a constant, visible reminder.
So the sacrifices themselves prove we're still in a transitional phase. Not yet perfect eternity, because reminders and instruction about sin are still needed.
Precisely. And this temple is described as being so real, so physical, that Revelation 20 actually says Satan will try to attack it at the very end of the 1,000 years.
Right, when he's briefly released. Okay, so this whole millennium is a period of massive change preparing the way. What does that look like for society, for the planet?
It's a world undergoing a deep clean. The character of eternity starts to take over. First, the curse from Genesis 3 is significantly rolled back.
How so?
Isaiah 11 and Romans 8 talk about this. The famous passage about the wolf dwelling with the lamb, the lion eating straw like the ox.
Predators become herbivores.
Essentially, yes. The natural order is restored to a pre-fall harmony. Imagine the impact on the ecosystem.
And human life changes dramatically too. You mentioned longevity.
Yes, Isaiah 65 suggests lifespans return to something like pre-flood lengths. People live for centuries again.
But not forever. Death still exists.
Death still exists. Isaiah 65 says someone dying at 100 years old will be considered, like, unusually young, maybe even cursed. So, long life, yes. Immortality, no, not yet. That distinction, again, highlights the transitional nature. Eternity is when death is finally abolished.
Okay, but maybe the biggest change for daily life is instant justice.
This seems to be a defining characteristic. The period of grace, as we know it, is over. Christ rules with a rod of iron, as Psalm 2 puts it.
What does that mean practically if someone sins?
The implication from texts like Zechariah 14 and Isaiah 11 is that judgment is immediate. There's no long delay, no complex legal process. The consequence follows the action swiftly.
Wow. So if someone lies, steals, rebels, the punishment is instant and obvious.
That seems to be the mechanism. It's designed to make righteousness the norm, almost routine, as Isaiah 9 suggests. The certainty and speed of justice act as a powerful deterrent, effectively eliminating crime and corruption as we know it.
Which naturally leads to global peace. No more wars, no political strife, because the ultimate authority is right there, enforcing his law instantly.
Exactly. Isaiah 2 talks about nations beating swords into plowshares, and with peace comes prosperity. Amos 9 and Isaiah 65 describe incredible abundance. People enjoying the fruits of their own labor without fear of theft or oppression or war.
So the millennium is this 1,000-year period of enforced righteousness, environmental healing, and societal transformation. It's a necessary preparation.
It's the great cleanup, preparing the planet and its inhabitants for the final, perfect state.
As this millennial kingdom progresses, the physical reality gets, well, extreme compared to now, reflecting God's increasing presence. It really does. And the conditions described push our understanding. Isaiah 30, verse 26, gives this incredible detail. The moonlight will be like sunlight, and the sunlight will be 7 times brighter than it is now, 7 times brighter. Hold on, how does anything survive that? Wouldn't that just scorch the earth? We worry about global warming now.
It's a staggering thought, isn't it? It points again to this being an intermediate state, preparing for something even more glorious. The sources imply that both the environment and the inhabitants are divinely adapted to withstand this.
So people are changed somehow to handle this intense light.
It seems necessary. This increased light is often interpreted as representing God's manifest glory and presence becoming more intense on earth during this cleansing phase. It underscores why the whole 1,000-year process is needed to acclimatize creation, step by step, for the full glory of eternity.
But even with this incredible light and divine rule, you said physical problems aren't entirely gone. People still get sick or injured.
That's what the sources suggest. Healing is still mentioned prominently. Isaiah 35 talks about the blind seeing, the deaf hearing, the lame leaping, so physical ailments still occur.
But the difference is how they're dealt with.
Yeah.
Yes, the key seems to be the immediacy of the response. Isaiah 65.24 says, "Before they call, I will answer. While they are still speaking, I will hear." So prayer for healing, for needs, is instantly met. The suffering or lack is incredibly short-lived. Okay, so it's a world rapidly approaching perfection, but not quite there. Instant justice, instant answers to prayer, but still potential for hurt, still mortality.
Exactly, it's the bridge. And this transformation includes massive changes to the Earth's actual geography, often linked to Christ's return, like the Mount of Olives splitting, which Zechariah describes.
And you mentioned the Dead Sea, that it comes back to life. That sounds almost mythological. Is it went literally?
The sources, especially Ezekiel 47, present it as a literal physical physical transformation. It's described as a direct result of God's power working through the millennial temple.
How does it happen?
Ezekiel sees a river flowing out from under the threshold of the temple in Jerusalem, heading eastward. It flows down into the Araba Valley and enters the Dead Sea.
And the Dead Sea, I mean, it's dead for a reason. Super high salt content, nothing lives in it.
Right. But Ezekiel says when this river enters the Dead Sea, its waters are healed, the saltiness is corrected, and the result, the sea begins to swarm with life. A very great multitude of fish, the text says. And not just fish. Along the banks of this river, trees grow that bear fruit every single month, and their leaves are for healing. It's this incredible picture of barrenness transformed into absolute abundance and life.
It takes the ultimate symbol of death and turns it into a source of life. Echoes of Eden, maybe? The river of life?
Strong echoes, yes. And it's not just the Dead Sea. Other prophecies talk about deserts blooming, abundant rainfall where there was none. Ezekiel 34, Isaiah 35. The whole planet's hydrology and climate seem to be radically renewed.
So the earth itself is being physically purified, restored, maybe even enhanced, getting ready for the final state.
Getting ready for absolute permanent purity, the eternal state.
So the 1,000 years of the millennium run their course. The great cleansing is complete. Satan makes his final brief rebellion and is defeated. Then comes the final judgment.
Yeah.
And after that, eternity. The permanent residence Daniel foresaw.
Yes. And the biggest indicator of this shift, this final transition, is what happens to that other key marker, the temple. It changes completely. We go from that incredibly detailed physical brick and mortar structure in the millennium
With its memorial sacrifices needed for that transitional phase.
to something entirely different. Entirely. In the eternal kingdom, the sources are explicit. There is no physical temple building. Revelation 21, verse 22 is just stunning. John is looking at the New Jerusalem, the eternal city, and he says, "And I saw no temple in the city." Why not?
For its temple is the Lord God the Almighty and the Lamb, God's own presence. That is the center of worship, the source of light, the reality that the physical temple only pointed towards.
So the physical temple was necessary when impurity still lingered, when mortals needed those physical reminders and structures. But once everything is perfectly pure, the reality replaces the symbol. God himself is the meeting place, the focal point. His presence fills everything. And this is what finally allows for that ultimate goal we started with, seeing God directly, face to face. Exactly. That's the promise. Romans 8.17 points to it being heirs with Christ, glorified together. It culminates in beholding the presence of God, our Father, in his full glory. Not shielded, not glimpsed, but seen.
But wait, the Old Testament is full of warnings. No one can see my face and live. Moses only saw God's back. Even the angels covered their faces. How is it suddenly safe, even desirable, to see God's full glory? What changed?
What changed is us and the environment. The issue was never that God is inherently toxic or terrifying in a way that prevents interaction. The issue was impurity. Our impurity, the contamination of sin.
God can't tolerate uncleanness.
Precisely. His perfect holiness consumes impurity. That's why direct contact was dangerous for sinful humans. But the sources show it wasn't impossible under specific, divinely prepared circumstances.
Like Moses. Remember in Numbers 12, God himself contrasts how he speaks to other prophets, visions, dreams, with how he speaks to Moses. With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly, and not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord, face to face. So it was possible for someone sufficiently prepared or purified.
It demonstrates the potential for direct interaction. God isn't inherently unapproachable. The barrier was sin. So the entire plan we've discussed, the covenants, Christ's sacrifice, the 4,000-year millennium, it's all about systematically, permanently removing that barrier.
Cleaning up the earth, yes, but more importantly, cleaning up the people who will inhabit it.
Exactly. The millennium achieves the environmental purification, but the ultimate state involves resurrected, glorified bodies for believers, bodies incapable of sin, perfectly pure, fit for God's immediate presence.
So when both the place and the people are perfectly pure, the danger is gone.
The danger is gone. The characters of eternity, perfect righteousness, perfect peace, are absolute. There's nothing left for God's holiness to consume. And so, the original desire of God to dwell with his people can be fully realized.
We can finally handle seeing him. We can mingle with God directly.
Yes. We'll be permanent residents on a purified earth, standing in the full unveiled glory of God, seeing him with our own eyes, because the sin that separated us is gone forever. It's the ultimate restoration.
Back to Eden, but better. Permanent, secure.
The fulfillment of everything God set in motion. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow, okay, we have really covered some ground today. We've traced this incredible arc from that first promise after the fall in Eden, through Nebuchadnezzar's vision in Babylon, which laid out the timeline, then diving deep into that 1,000-year millennial kingdom.
That essential physical cleansing phase.
And landing finally in the eternal state, where the barriers are down and the ultimate promise is fulfilled. And I think the critical takeaway, the synthesis here, is understanding those two distinct phases. You've got the Millennium, literal, physical, tangible changes, the resurrected David, the brick-and-mortar temple with sacrifices, the Dead Sea coming alive. That's the necessary, powerful, intermediate step. The bridge, and then you have eternity. The spiritual reality takes over. The temple is God himself and the Lamb. Impurity is gone forever. And that's what allows us to finally, safely behold God's full glory, to see him face to face. The sources paint this unified picture. It's all one grand restoration project, heading towards that final destination, a permanent physical home on a purified earth, where we can actually dwell in God's presence because the problem of sin has been completely and eternally solved. So thinking about this whole journey, what does it mean for you listening right now? We describe this millennial world where justice is instant, no gray areas, no getting away with things. Righteousness is enforced.
A world dramatically different from ours, absolutely. But here's something to maybe chew on, a final thought based on these sources. If the whole point of the millennium is this intense cleansing, this enforced righteousness through instant justice, what does that say about human free will during that 1,000 years? Interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, if the consequences for sin are immediate and unavoidable, are the mortals born during that time truly choosing righteousness freely? Or is their behavior simply conditioned by the certainty of swift punishment?
Are they obeying out of love and transformation or out of, self-preservation?
Yeah.
Exactly. And maybe even more pointedly, what does the fact that Revelation says there's still a rebellion possible at the very end of the millennium when Satan is let loose for that short time? What does that tell us about the persistence of human choice, the potential to reject God, even after 1,000 years of perfect government and relative peace? Even in an almost perfect environment, choice remains. It's a profound thought about the nature of free will and God's ultimate plan.
Something to reflect on as you consider this whole path from our current world to that ultimate goal of seeing God in eternity.
Definitely food for thought. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
We'll see you next time. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. So, today we dove into some really interesting sources. They're all focused on, maybe the biggest challenge we face now. How do you find some stability? A solid foundation, especially when everything feels like information overload, constant change, trends that just vanish. We're looking at one source's idea for finding that rock-solid anchor.
That's right. And for you listening, our mission really is to unpack this specific solution the source gives, how to navigate life without feeling like totally adrift all the time. The material suggests choosing an identity, a whole guidance system that the source says it can't be canceled or deleted. Pretty strong words. Okay, so let's get right to that foundation then. The source seems to argue that for any system to really last, it needs wisdom that's already proven itself. It has to go way beyond just, advice based on the fleeting trend of the day. That's a huge claim about longevity. So what proof does the source actually offer? How do they argue their anchor is more than just, say, tradition? Yeah, and what's fascinating is the scale of the proof they point to. It's quite ambitious. The source really builds its case around the historical impact of Jesus Christ. I mean, it states pretty directly that his words, his actions, his core claims, they still define global history, morality, culture, even after 2,000 years. That's presented as like the ultimate proof of lasting power.
2 millennia.
Right. Citing impact on, everything from human rights concepts to how charity became institutionalized. And they contrast this durability, this staying power, directly with how quickly things fade today, any given social algorithm, influencer, or political movement. None of that lasts, they argue.
Okay, so if that history provides the anchor, the stability, how does the source say we, apply that longevity to just getting through the week, Tuesday morning chaos? How does this real-time guidance system actually work day to day? Does it just become rigid rules?
That's a key point. The source frames it less as some abstract escape plan for the future and more like plugging into something active, dynamic for life right now. The core mechanism described is turning your life over to Jesus Christ, which the source is specific here. It defines that as submitting to the Holy Spirit's power.
Okay, submitting to the Holy Spirit's power. Let's unpack that a bit for the listener. How does the document explain that mechanism? Is it like a feeling or?
It's explained more as integrating an objective moral code, something that acts like a filter against maybe impulsive short-term decisions, rather than just going by subjective feelings, which can be, all over the place.
Right. So the system's kind of structured to provide a personal internal coach.
Yeah.
Helping people develop, what did the source say? Social discipline, strength, and authentic and resilient character. The stuff you need to navigate, tough environments like college, your career, relationships. Sounds like it's aiming for resilience.
Exactly. Resilience is a good word for it. And importantly, the source is really clear. This isn't meant to be a solo journey. A lot of self-help focuses only on the individual. But this document, it flat out states that fellowship is non-negotiable.
Community. That definitely stood out. This non-negotiable role of community. What practical function does the source say this squad or family, the local church, actually serves in the whole system?
It gets pretty practical about it. The source claims that community structure provides really vital hands-on support. Things like accountability, making sure you stick with it, shared mission, and also immediate crisis support, because life inevitably is going to knock you off balance sometimes. The source insists that the kind of character needed for resilience, it's best built, best forged in that context of learning together, growing together with others who are tied to the same anchor.
Okay, so wrapping this up for someone trying to take all this in, what's the takeaway? The call to action in the source seems, well, pretty urgent, actually. It's basically saying, don't wait. Don't wait until you have all the answers figured out or until the world magically calms down, which, let's face it, might be never. The advice is start building that foundation now. Move from just drifting to being grounded.
Yeah, start now. And that leaves us with a really interesting question for you to think about. The source defines foundational wisdom as something that doesn't just withstand history, but actually defines it over thousands of years. So here's the thought. What specific, maybe objective traits would any system, whether it's religious, philosophical, maybe even scientific, what would it absolutely need to possess to achieve that kind of incredible, enduring relevance, that functional resilience, especially when culture and technology are changing faster than ever? What makes something truly last?